Welcome to Reform Thinking.
Glad to be here.
So in winter of 2022, Europe was quietly preparing for the unthinkable.
Yeah, rolling blackouts, freezing homes, that sort of thing.
Right, in the dead of winter. And, I mean, the forced shutdown of their entire industrial heartland.
It is terrifying to think about.
It really is. And all of this happened because a single assumption like a philosophy really had just blown up in their faces.
Yeah.
Today, we are looking at how a continent lost its energy supply, but we are doing it through a very specific lens.
A really unique one.
Yeah, we are going to examine a 3,000-year-old warning from the prophet Isaiah that predicted this precise type of collapse.
We have two really fascinating sources driving this deep dive today.
What are we looking at?
Well, one is a rigorous geopolitical analysis that details Europe's structural shift away from Russian natural gas. It maps out concepts like grid hardening and plural dependence.
Okay, very technical.
Yeah. But the other source is a theological critique titled Chariots of Gas and Horses of Flesh.
Wow, what a title.
Right. The author of this piece looks at the modern European energy crisis and sees a symptom of secular pragmatism.
Specifically regarding human nature. Right.
Spot on. They see it as a failure to recognize the orthodox doctrine of man's total depravity.
And just to set the stage for you listening, these sources contain very strong, opinionated arguments about secularism, globalism, and humanism.
Yeah, very strong viewpoints.
We want to be clear that we are not taking a stance on the author's political conclusions. We are just evaluating the ideas as presented in the text.
Yeah, we're simply analyzing the fascinating parallel the author draws between ancient Judah and modern Europe without taking a side.
All right, so the best place to start is the world as it existed right before February 2022.
The pre-war illusion, basically.
Yeah, if we want to understand why the crash was so devastating, you have to understand the sheer height of the tower they were building.
Oh, absolutely.
The geopolitical reality for Europe before the war was defined by an energy model optimized entirely for cheap efficiency.
It was a system built completely for peacetime.
Right. In 2020, the European Union imported 57.5% of its total energy.
Which is high.
It is. But when you isolate natural gas, the import dependency rate was a staggering 83.6%.
That is a massive concentration of risk.
And the single largest provider was Russia, supplying over 40% of the total EU gas demand on average between 2018 and 2021.
Having over 40% of your natural gas tied to a single external supplier well, it looks reckless in hindsight.
Definitely.
But at the time, the strategy appeared entirely rational to the architects of European foreign policy. Russian pipeline gas was incredibly cheap.
And the infrastructure was already there, right?
Yeah, massive pipelines stretching across the continent were already in place. But beyond the economics, natural gas fit perfectly into Europe's broader decarbonization strategy.
Right, they were trying to go green.
Yeah, they were actively trying to phase down coal usage and expand renewable generation like wind and solar.
I think we need to break down the mechanics of that.
Go for it.
Because the phrase bridge fuel gets thrown around a lot. But the physics of the electrical grid explain why they became so dependent.
Right, the balancing act.
Yeah, an electrical grid has to balance supply and demand perfectly at every single second.
No room for error.
None. And wind and solar are intermittent. Sometimes the wind stops blowing or a cloud cover drops solar output dramatically.
So what happens then?
When that happens, grid operators need a fuel source they can turn on instantly to prevent a blackout. You cannot just spin up a coal plant in 5 minutes.
Or a nuclear reactor. That takes days to adjust safely.
Exactly. But a natural gas turbine, you can fire it up and have it feeding massive amounts of electricity into the grid almost instantly.
It was the perfect physical bridge.
Yeah, it offered affordability, scale, and flexibility all at once.
And that physical utility is the very thing that allowed a practical choice to calcify into a structural dependency.
Yeah, they got hooked on it.
They really did.
Yeah.
But this is where the theological source introduces a completely different diagnosis.
I found this part so interesting.
While economists saw a highly efficient market, the theological author looks at this exact same setup and calls it the world's primary delusion.
The author defines that delusion as the stubborn belief that permanent earthly peace can be achieved through economic interdependence.
Right. Buying peace with trade.
I was looking at how they framed this, and it essentially boils down to the theory of Ostpolitik.
The Cold War policy.
Yeah. This was championed by leaders like Willy Brandt based on the idea of change through trade.
So what was the thinking there?
The theory was that if you bind an adversary to your economy, if you buy enough of their gas and sell them enough of your manufactured goods, You make war financially impossible.
Ah, mutually assured economic destruction.
Right. But the author argues that by relying on an adversarial provider through decades of this policy, European leadership willfully ignored the reality of human depravity.
They assumed commerce could cure the human condition.
Yes, they assumed that the bonds of commerce could permanently override the fallen, selfish nature of humanity.
And you see that delusion manifested physically in the infrastructure.
How so?
Decades of diplomatic theories were poured into concrete and welded into pipelines under the Baltic Sea.
Wow.
The critique is that Europe built a massive continent-wide system, assuming everyone would behave rationally and peacefully.
As long as the money kept flowing.
Right. It makes me think of building a massive, gorgeous house directly on a fault line without earthquake insurance.
Oh, that is a great analogy.
You do it simply because the insurance is expensive and, well, the ground has not shaken in a few decades.
So you just forget the fault line's even there.
Yeah, you live there long enough, and you start to believe the fault line is actually just a normal piece of land. You convince yourself that geology has changed because your house is so nice.
That captures the collective blind spot perfectly. When a system provides cheap electricity and high flexibility year after year, policymakers naturally start to treat the dominant supplier as a permanent, immovable fixture.
They mistake a temporary market condition for a law of nature.
Yeah, a period of relative peace and cheap extraction just becomes the assumed baseline.
And efficient systems are designed to minimize spare capacity because spare capacity costs money.
Right, backup plans are expensive.
So Europe allowed its backup options, like domestic natural gas extraction, to slowly erode. They concentrated their risk into a single point of failure, fully assuming that mutual commerce would forever prevent conflict.
Well, this specific reliance on Russian gas feels like a very modern problem born of the industrial age. The human impulse behind it is ancient.
Oh, very ancient.
When you strip away the modern technology, the psychological motivation is identical to what we see in the ancient world.
This brings us to the historical parallel in the source, right?
Yeah, the theological source takes us back to the 8th century BC, specifically focusing on the historical context surrounding Isaiah chapter 31.
We are looking at the southern kingdom of Judah.
Right, ruled by King Hezekiah. And they were absolutely terrified of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, led by King Sennacherib.
To understand the weight of that fear, we really have to look at the Assyrian war machine.
They were brutal.
They were the dominant, ruthless superpower of the ancient Near East. They were rapidly expanding westward, just swallowing up smaller kingdoms.
And their tactics were horrifying.
Yeah, they were known for mastering siege warfare, using massive iron-tipped battering rams and psychological terror. They would literally flay conquered leaders alive.
Oh, man.
And they would stack the skulls of their enemies outside the city gates. This was not just a political dispute.
No, it was an existential threat of absolute annihilation.
So to survive that kind of threat, the leaders of Jerusalem looked south. They sought a military alliance with Egypt.
Because Egypt was considered the superpower of the South, right?
Yeah, famed for their highly advanced chariotry and their strategic breeding of war horses.
The author of the theological text draws a very explicit mapping here.
Let's unpack that.
The Neo-Assyrian war machine is the historical equivalent of the modern Russian military threat facing Eastern Europe.
Okay, the threat from the north.
Yeah, and the Egyptian horses and chariots are the 8th century equivalent of high-yield natural gas pipelines or modern nuclear deterrence.
So for the people of Judah, the Egyptian chariot was the apex technology of security.
It was the F-35 fighter jet of the ancient world.
The physical mechanics of the Egyptian chariot explain why Judah was so desperate for them.
Very fast.
Yeah, light, incredibly lethal platforms. They used spoked wheels and advanced bronze weaponry pulled by highly disciplined horses.
In the flat terrains of the Levant, a massive chariot force was an overwhelming tactical advantage.
But this is where the theological indictment lands.
Why?
Seeking that help was a direct violation of the covenant Judah had with God. The source points out that the king of Judah was explicitly forbidden from returning to Egypt to multiply horses.
Ah, referencing the command in Deuteronomy 17:16.
Right. So seeking Egypt's help was not just clever foreign policy.
It was pure secular pragmatism.
It was a willful substitution of the sovereign decree of God for a horizontal earthly alliance.
Wait, I have to stop the analysis right there and push back on the author's premise.
Sure, what is the objection?
Because if I am King Hezekiah, and the Assyrian army is literally outside my city walls building siege ramps, going to Egypt does not feel like a philosophical delusion or spiritual adultery.
It feels like basic responsible governance.
Right. You have a duty to protect your citizens from being slaughtered. How does the author reconcile the practical necessity of survival with this theological condemnation?
It is the most natural objection to raise, and the source addresses this tension directly by examining the prophet's flow of thought.
Okay, what is the argument?
The argument is that the object of one's trust determines one's destiny. The horses in this text were not just literal animals used for transport.
They were symbols.
Yeah, symbols of autonomous security. Trusting them was categorized by the prophet Isaiah as spiritual adultery because it was a public declaration that visible, tangible military might was more reliable than the invisible providence of Yahweh.
So the leaders of Judah were saying, in effect, that God's promises were insufficient for the real world.
Precisely.
I want you to picture the sheer technological awe an 8th century Judean would feel seeing a battalion of Egyptian chariots.
Oh, it would be overwhelming.
The polished wood, the gleaming bronze, the sheer speed and noise of the horses. Compare that to how a modern European energy minister views a massive, humming electrical grid.
Or a colossal liquefied natural gas terminal on the coast.
Right. Both of these things inspire a very specific type of awe. They look so solid.
They offer a false sense of absolute invincibility.
The parallel hinges on that false sense of invincibility, whether it is a fleet of Egyptian chariots in the ancient Near East or a network of Russian pipelines in modern Europe. Any infrastructure built on a denial of human depravity is destined for a massive shock.
When you assume the system is immune to the fallen nature of man, you leave yourself completely exposed.
Exposed to the moment when human selfishness and aggression inevitably shatter the system.
And that brings us right back to February 2022.
The geopolitical earthquake hit.
Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the illusion of pragmatic security was completely shattered.
When the Assyrians finally broke through the walls, the Judeans realized the Egyptian chariots were not coming.
And Europe had its own Assyrians at the gates moment.
Suddenly, the philosophical debate about the nature of man was not happening in a theology classroom.
No, it was happening on the trading floors in Brussels as the pipelines literally ran dry.
The numbers provided by the geopolitical source illustrate the sheer violence of this economic shock.
Let's hear the data.
Russian pipeline deliveries to Europe collapsed from 150 billion cubic meters in 2021 to a projected 40 to 52 billion cubic meters by 2024.
That is a massive sudden withdrawal of supply.
And it caused natural gas prices to spike to a staggering 336 euros per megawatt hour in August 2022.
Suddenly, the European Union was dealing with 160 billion cubic meters of missing gas.
We have to translate those numbers into reality.
Because it is hard to grasp that volume.
It is an almost incomprehensible volume of fuel. When you strip away the abstraction, we are talking about the lifeblood of entire industrial sectors.
Like what? Give me an example.
Think about a massive glass manufacturing plant in Germany. A facility like that cannot just turn down the thermostat and wait out the winter.
Right. The furnaces run continuously.
If the natural gas stops flowing and the furnaces cool down, the molten glass hardens inside the machinery, and the entire factory is permanently ruined.
Wow.
And a price spike to 336 euros per megawatt hour means fertilizer plants shut down.
Which means food prices skyrocket.
The physical reality of that cutoff is staggering. The system completely broke.
The theological source synthesizes this catastrophic failure by pointing us to the central verse of Isaiah 31, verse 3.
What does the text say?
It reads, "The Egyptians are man and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit."
So, relying on the flesh.
Right. The author argues that the 2022 energy shock was a common grace judgment on the folly of humanism.
It exposed a system built upon the shifting sand of secular optimism.
It laid bare the reality that the supplier was not a benign trading partner,
but a fallen human actor willing to use freezing temperatures as a weapon.
The geopolitical text is very clear that the system failed because leaders confused market efficiency with strategic security.
They treated low-cost energy as if it were resilient energy.
They completely underestimated how quickly a physical dependence on infrastructure becomes geopolitical coercion.
Especially when a supplier decides to weaponize that interconnection.
That is the direct consequence of treating energy as a standard traded commodity, like wheat or steel, rather than recognizing it as a strategic system tied directly to national sovereignty.
The crisis taught them a brutal lesson.
Which was?
A system optimized for ordinary, peaceful market conditions will fail catastrophically under the stress of geopolitical conflict.
Think about how insulated we are from this reality on a daily basis.
Oh, completely insulated.
You walk into your house, flick a switch, and you expect the room to light up. You turn the dial on the thermostat, and you expect hot air to fill the room.
We live our lives completely detached from the fragile diplomatic treaties, the precarious supply chains, and the underlying geology keeping that light on.
The theological source uses a piercing phrase from Isaiah. When the helper stumbles, the helped one falls.
Wow.
When the nation supplying the gas uses the pipeline as a weapon, the entire continent feels the freeze.
But Europe did not just sit in the dark and accept defeat, right?
No, they reacted with massive structural changes.
But the text forces us to ask a difficult question.
Did they actually learn the underlying lesson about where to place their trust?
Or did they just decide to build a thicker, more technologically advanced wall?
This leads us to analyze their massive shift from an efficiency model to a resilience model.
The geopolitical source outlines this reaction, focusing specifically on a strategy called grid hardening.
So what does grid hardening actually look like?
Well, because European policy aims to drastically increase electricity consumption by 60% by 2030, mostly driven by the mass adoption of heat pumps and electric vehicles, the physical grid has to be capable of handling a massive new load.
Oh, okay, so a huge increase in demand.
Yeah. Yet the data shows that 40% of the distribution grids in Europe are currently over 40 years old.
That sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
It is. The estimated cost to modernize and harden this infrastructure is an eye-watering 584 billion euros.
We need to define what grid hardening actually entails because it goes far beyond stringing up thicker copper wires.
Right. It is not just physical cables.
No, the modern electrical grid is a continent-wide, hyper-connected digital system. It is basically a massive cardiovascular system for the economy.
So cybersecurity is a huge part of this.
Huge. The source details the NIS2 directive, which focuses heavily on cyber defense.
Because grids are managed by digital SCADA systems.
Right. Yeah, supervisory control and data acquisition. A cyber incident initiated by a hostile state hacker can cause a massive supply crisis without a single physical bomb being dropped.
So hardening means defending those information systems.
It means installing 1 million tiny digital pacemakers to ensure an attack in one country does not flatline the entire European continent.
Grid hardening also involves incredible feats of physical resilience. A prime example from the text is the emergency synchronization of Ukraine and Moldova's transmission system operators.
To the continental European grid, right,
Wow.
on March 16, 2022.
Yeah, I looked into how this works, and the engineering is astounding.
Break it down for us.
The entire European grid operates on a strict frequency of 50 hertz. If supply drops suddenly, the frequency drops.
And if it drops too far.
The entire grid collapses into a blackout to protect the generators. Synchronizing two separate national grids while one is actively under military bombardment requires matching that exact frequency perfectly.
That is unbelievable under those conditions.
They managed to connect their grids under wartime conditions, effectively turning the physical electrical grid into a literal instrument of international solidarity.
The theological perspective on this physical reaction is highly nuanced.
How so?
The theological author does not condemn the engineering feats or the desire to build better grids.
Oh, that is interesting.
Yeah, the source explicitly views grid hardening like adding domestic energy options or maintaining steady nuclear generation as a necessary act of wise stewardship.
It is considered a valid, common grace response to the reality of living in a fallen, dangerous world.
That is a crucial distinction. The text is not arguing for willful unpreparedness.
You do not just leave your doors unlocked and expect God to keep the burglars out.
Right, but it introduces a really heavy tension.
Let's think about this like a medieval castle.
Okay, I like that.
Imagine you live in a castle and the stone walls are violently breached by an enemy army. Obviously, your immediate reaction is to rebuild the walls.
Sure, you reinforce the stone, you dig a deeper moat, you build the towers higher.
But at what point does this necessary practical defense cross the line into the sin of self-salvation?
That is the big question.
If we replace the horses of Egypt with a perfectly hardened, cyber-secure, technologically advanced green energy grid, haven't we just created a shiny new idol?
The source affirms that exact tension. The theological text explicitly warns that grid hardening must never become a false refuge, replacing dependence on providence.
Because if a society genuinely believes that a 584 billion euro investment in infrastructure makes them permanently immune to the judgment of God,
Or the chaotic realities of a fallen world.
they have simply traded one false idol for another.
The infrastructure is a tool for stewardship. It is not a savior.
And we have to remember that grid hardening only deals with the infrastructure itself, the wires, the transformers, and the software.
Europe also had to radically alter where the actual physical fuel flowing through those wires was coming from.
They executed a massive historic pivot in their global supply chains.
This strategy is what the geopolitical source refers to as plural dependence.
The supply-side shift they managed to execute in a matter of months was immense.
Give us the stats on that.
Europe reduced its Russian gas imports from 45% of total imports down to just 12% by 2025.
To replace that volume of fuel, they had to diversify heavily across the globe.
The United States stepped in, right?
Yeah, the U.S. became the largest supplier of liquefied natural gas, or LNG. The share of LNG in EU gas demand rose from 12% in the 2010s to over 35% since 2022.
And the mechanics of LNG transport highlight just how desperate this situation was.
Because you cannot just pump LNG through a pipe.
No, you have to extract the gas in Texas, chill it down to negative 162 degrees Celsius so it condenses into a liquid,
Then load it onto massive, highly specialized thermos-like ships.
sail it across the Atlantic, and then warm it back up into a gas at specialized coastal terminals in Europe.
It is a logistical nightmare compared to a simple pipeline, but it kept the lights on.
They paired that massive LNG logistical effort with an internal shift, too.
With renewable.
Yeah, clean energy generated 70% of EU electricity in 2025, with wind and solar alone hitting 30%.
Furthermore, they aggressively targeted the demand side.
People using less energy.
Right. Between August 2022 and January 2025, they managed to cut overall gas demand by 17%.
Which equals about 70 billion cubic meters per year.
And they passed mandates requiring nations to fill their storage facilities, reaching 83% capacity by October 2025.
Plural dependence essentially means they recognize that they cannot achieve pure autonomy.
No nation in Europe has the natural resources to produce everything they need domestically.
So instead of a singular, highly weaponized dependence on a hostile Russia, they moved to a distributed plural dependence across global markets.
They combined American LNG ships, domestic wind turbines, and vast underground storage reserves.
And lowering demand became a strategic asset. Learning to survive on less energy is a legitimate form of national security.
Let's view this massive logistical shift through the lens of Isaiah.
Okay, what does the theology say about this?
The theological source argues that while diversifying energy sources is a remarkable common grace mercy, it literally kept millions of people from freezing to death. Changing the source of the fuel does absolutely nothing to cure the human condition.
Switching from Russian pipeline gas to American LNG, or moving away from fossil fuels entirely over to domestic wind and solar energy, is just trading one set of chariots for another.
It is all still flesh.
The author is pointing out an unavoidable physical reality. Wind turbines wear out.
LNG terminals can be sabotaged.
Ships can be delayed by storms. They are material objects subject to decay, disruption, and human error.
It is very much like diversifying an investment portfolio.
Yeah, if you have your entire life savings tied up in a single technology stock, and that company goes bankrupt, you are ruined.
So a wise financial advisor tells you to spread your investments across different sectors, healthcare, real estate, bonds, to mitigate your earthly risk.
That is smart, wise stewardship.
But diversifying your portfolio does absolutely nothing to fix a fundamentally bankrupt spiritual state.
It just makes you more comfortable and secure in your spiritual bankruptcy.
Exactly. Plural dependence successfully makes coercion much more difficult for a hostile state to execute.
If Russia cuts off the gas, Europe can call up a fleet of ships from the US or Qatar.
But it does not remove the underlying fragility of human systems. Maintaining this complex, diverse portfolio of global energy requires intense, ongoing, highly coordinated cooperation among dozens of sovereign nations.
Which brings us to the harsh political reality. As the crisis drags on year after year, the reality of human nature threatens to fracture the very cooperation required to keep the plural dependence functioning.
What are the specific political challenges of maintaining this resilient, hardened system?
The geopolitical text highlights a very dark reality. Energy poverty.
It is a massive issue.
It affects more than 46 million Europeans.
Yeah.
Between 2021 and 2023, the cost of electricity surged dramatically for the average citizen.
Largely tied to the volatile spot prices of natural gas.
The geopolitical analysis points out that voters do not experience international strategy in abstract terms.
They do not care about import dependency ratios.
They experience geopolitics through the reality of inflation and the shock of opening their monthly utility bills.
If the citizens cannot afford to turn on the heat in December, the grand geopolitical strategy happening in Brussels means nothing to them.
The European Union recognized this inherent political vulnerability, so they attempted to legislate a solution.
Right. They created a solidarity mechanism under Regulation 2017-1938.
The goal of this legal framework is to mandate the sharing of natural gas across national borders during extreme crises.
They understand that robust consumer protection and shared burden are required to sustain democratic legitimacy for these incredibly expensive infrastructure transitions.
Because if the financial cost of grid resilience falls entirely on the working class, public support for the government will collapse.
This is where we bring in the concept of the woe oracle from the book of Isaiah, as analyzed by our theological source.
A woe oracle in the prophetic literature carries the heavy, mournful gravity of a funeral lament.
The author argues that secular leadership constantly attempts to mandate solidarity through legal frameworks, like that EU regulation you mentioned, while willfully ignoring the doctrine of total depravity.
Because the member states of the European Union have completely different fiscal capacities, vastly different industrial exposures, and highly varying domestic political pressures.
The source argues that human selfishness will always eventually strain these artificial bonds.
Consider the incredible tension here. It is very easy for diplomats to smile and sign a solidarity agreement in a comfortable climate control conference room in the middle of summer.
But flash forward to the dead of winter.
Your own citizens are facing severe energy poverty. Your domestic factories are threatening to shut down and lay off thousands of workers.
In that exact moment, does a piece of paper override human nature?
Will a political leader willingly ship millions of cubic meters of necessary natural gas across a border to a neighboring country while their own voters are freezing in the dark?
The theological text argues that human treaties are always subject to the survival instincts of fallen man. Secular victories are inherently fragile.
The modern world continually preaches a specific gospel, that man can engineer his way to a permanent utopia through heavy regulation, through carefully crafted international treaties, and through complex market interventions.
But the author maintains that true, unshakable solidarity exists only within the covenant of grace.
So, if the physical power grids are vulnerable to cyberattacks, and the global supply chains are vulnerable to market shocks and logistical failures, and the political treaties are vulnerable to human selfishness, you are forced to ask a massive question.
Is there any infrastructure in the universe that actually holds up?
This leads us directly to the structural pivot of Isaiah chapter 31.
The prophet demands a move from the horizontal gaze to the vertical gaze.
He tells the leaders of Judah to stop looking horizontally to Egypt and their chariots for help, and to look vertically to the Holy One of Israel.
The theological source anchors this pivot in the concept of God's immutability.
The text points out the stark irony dripping from Isaiah 31, verse 2.
What is the irony?
The politicians in Jerusalem thought they were being incredibly clever, negotiating complex military alliances with Egypt. But the prophet says, "Yet he also is wise and brings disaster. He does not call back his words."
God is the one who decrees the flow of human history.
The implicit idea here aligns perfectly with the historical Christian understanding of the divine decree. God ordains whatsoever comes to pass, and his purposes cannot be thwarted.
This is the ultimate, absolute contrast to the failing, shifting flesh of human politics and energy grids.
The author's analysis of verse 3 is where the central Christological connection is made.
Right. The verse plainly states the Egyptians are man and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit.
The source argues that this sharp ontological contrast between man and God, between the frailty of flesh and the might of spirit, highlights the absolute necessity of the incarnation.
We need to unpack how the text connects the failure of ancient Egyptian chariots and modern Russian pipelines to the incarnation of Christ.
The argument flows like this. Humanity constantly fails to secure itself because we continually rely on flesh.
We build systems out of flesh, and flesh always decays.
Therefore, we need a mediator who can bridge the infinite chasm between the failing flesh and the immutable spirit.
Christ became flesh without ceasing to be spirit.
He entered directly into the frailty and vulnerability of the human condition, taking on flesh, yet he possessed the invincible, unchanging might of the Spirit.
He succeeded in perfect obedience where every earthly king, every political alliance, and every infrastructure project has entirely failed.
There is a beautiful, striking image from the source that brings this entire geopolitical and theological discussion together.
What is the image?
The text notes that Isaiah 31 says the hand of God will be stretched out in righteous judgment against the chariots of Egypt.
The helper will stumble and the helped will fall.
But the author points out that this exact same hand, the mighty hand of the Holy One of Israel, was stretched out and literally nailed to a Roman cross. The crushing judgment that should have fallen on a rebellious people who constantly trust in earthly pragmatism fell instead on Christ. He absorbed the shock to provide true, eternal security for his people.
It is a massive theological inversion. The righteous judgment against the flesh is completely absorbed by the Word made flesh.
Let's build an analogy for this based on everything we have discussed about energy.
Okay.
Think of Christ's active obedience as a perfect, unassailable energy grid.
It is an infinite resource that never experiences a blackout, no matter the conditions.
It cannot be hacked by an enemy, it cannot be coerced by a hostile state, and it perfectly covers the exact sin and bondage of our constant misplaced trust in earthly systems.
Every other grid, whether it is an alliance with Egypt or a €584 billion investment in European wires, requires us to generate our own security through massive effort and expense.
But this grid provides total security entirely by grace.
The author asks you to view the daily news cycle completely differently based on this reality.
When you read the headlines about global energy grids failing, economic treaties fracturing, or supply chains moving across the globe, you should see them for what they truly are.
You are simply watching the flesh attempt to secure itself against the inevitable chaotic disruptions of a fallen world.
For the listener who is anchored to Christ, the terrifying anxiety of geopolitics is replaced by a deep, resting peace in sovereign providence.
The headlines stop being a source of panic when you realize exactly who holds the pen writing human history.
Let's pull all of this together and recap the massive concepts we have covered.
We examined Europe's structural shift from a highly efficient, fragile gas model heavily reliant on Russian pipelines to a new paradigm defined by grid hardening and plural dependence on global LNG and renewables.
It acts as a fascinating, real-world case study in geopolitical resilience and the severe limits of secular cooperation.
Yet, when viewed through the piercing lens of the prophet Isaiah, this entire continental crisis functions as a glaring mirror.
It reflects humanity's constant, repetitive desire to find salvation in the physical material of the world, in military alliances, in technology, in treaties, rather than trusting the Creator who sustains the world.
You might not be managing a national energy portfolio today.
You probably aren't sitting in a room deciding how many billions of euros to spend on international transmission lines or cybersecurity directives.
But you are constantly making decisions about where to place your own trust. You are building your own personal infrastructure of security every single day.
The human heart is always actively looking for a new cherry to ride in.
Always.
So we want to leave you with a final piercing question to consider on your own as you go about your week.
What specific horses and chariots are you currently stockpiling in your own life?
Perhaps it is your upward career trajectory, your rapidly growing savings account, or your intense dedication to a specific political party.
Could it be that the very things you think are securing your future against disaster are actually insulating you from relying on the only kingdom that cannot be shaken?
Thank you for joining this deep dive into the sources. We will see you next time.